Hello and welcome to Silent Echo. Before we continue, please subscribe and like this video if you want more dark documentary investigations into real disappearances and unresolved cases that still refuse to let go. A woman leaves her apartment for work before sunrise. Her car is waiting only a few steps away. The drive to the television station is less than 5 minutes. She has already called in to say she overslept and that she is on her way. Then the line between an ordinary morning and a permanent mystery closes in less than half a minute. When police reach the parking lot, they do not find an empty space where her car should have been. They find the car still there. They find one red high heel on the ground. They find the other nearby. They find a blow dryer. They find hairspray. They find earrings. They find a bent key. They find marks in the parking lot that suggest she did not simply change her mind and go back upstairs. And then they realize something far worse. Whatever happened to Jodi Huisentruit seems to have happened within sight of her own front door, not on a remote highway, not in a distant field, not after hours of uncertainty. It happened in a place that should have felt routine and safe and completely unremarkable. That is what makes this case endure. Because the mystery does not begin with a long gap in the timeline. It begins with a timeline that is brutally tight. She was at home. She answered the phone. She said she was coming in. Her car was parked just outside. Her station was expecting her in minutes. Then there are signs of a struggle in the lot. Then there is no Jodi. For decades, this case has been described as one of the most haunting unsolved disappearances in American broadcast journalism. A young morning anchor on her way to work. A parking lot crime scene before dawn. No body ever found. No one ever charged. Only fragments. Only names. Only theories that grow stronger in public memory at the exact moment the hard evidence seems to run out. And that is where a story like this becomes dangerous, because the more famous an unsolved case becomes, the easier it is to repeat the parts that have hardened into folklore and miss the colder truth underneath. That truth is simpler and more disturbing. A 27-year-old news anchor disappeared on June 27, 1995, in Mason City, Iowa. She is believed to have been abducted outside her apartment complex between roughly 4 and 4:30 in the morning while leaving to anchor the early news at KIMT TV. Her red Mazda Miata was found in the parking lot, with personal items scattered beside it and with clear signs that something had gone wrong. 30 years later, her case remains unsolved. Police continue to investigate. New searches still happen. Public interest has never fully faded. And for all the attention this case has drawn, the central question has not changed. How does someone disappear in the span of a few steps? That question is what keeps pulling people back. Not only because Jodi was young, or visible, or familiar from morning television. Not only because there are signs of violence without a confirmed ending, but because this case creates a very specific kind of fear. The fear of interruption. The fear that a normal morning can be broken so fast that the entire rest of your life becomes an echo around one unfinished moment. In a different kind of story, the mystery would begin far from home. It would begin on a trail or on a dark road or in open country where distance can hide 1,000 explanations. Here the opposite is true. The mystery begins at the edge of convenience, at the edge of habit, at the edge of a job she had done over and over again. Wake up too early. Drive to the station. Read the morning news. Talk to the same coworkers. Move through a routine so familiar it should have protected her. And maybe that is one reason this case has lasted. It violates the kind of logic people depend on. If she had disappeared in the middle of nowhere, there would at least be room for the landscape to swallow evidence. If her car had been found abandoned miles away, there would be distance to account for uncertainty. But this happened in a parking lot, in Mason City, near other apartments, near other windows, near a route she drove almost every morning. It was not the right place for a person to vanish, and yet that is exactly what happened. So to understand why this case still holds people the way it does, We have to stay disciplined. We have to separate what is confirmed from what has only been repeated. We have to resist the urge to turn every rumor into a clue. And we have to move through Jodi's last known hours the same way investigators had to move through them. Carefully, piece by piece. Because almost everything in this case comes down to timing. What time she was expected. What time the station called. What time she answered. What time she should have crossed the parking lot. What time someone may have heard a scream. What time police arrived and saw the scene that told them this was not a simple missing person case. Jodi Huisentruit had ambitions beyond Mason City. Like many young television reporters, she was doing the difficult early years of local news on the path to something bigger. She had already worked in other small markets. She was applying for bigger jobs. She was close to home in one sense, and already leaning beyond it in another. The future of her life still seemed open and directional. And then, one summer morning, that future narrows into one of the most infamous unsolved abductions in the Midwest. The horror of this case is not only that Jodi disappeared, it is that the disappearance seems to begin in motion. She does not vanish from sleep. She does not vanish while no one is looking for her. She vanishes after she says she is on the way. That phrase matters. It matters because it collapses the distance between the living known person and the unknown absence that follows. She is not lost to the story yet. She is still audible, still in the day, still on the edge of arrival. Then the next concrete thing anyone can point to is the crime scene around her car. That is the fracture. That is where this case lives. And for the next hour, we are going to stay inside that fracture. We are going to look at who Jodi was, what her life in Mason City actually looked like, how that final morning unfolded, what the physical evidence did and did not say, what theories have survived and why they fail to fully settle the case, and why, after 30 years, the image that keeps returning is still the same. A red Miata waiting in a parking lot before dawn, a bent key, 2 red shoes, and no sign of the woman who should have been driving to work. To understand the force of that final morning, you have to understand the life that led into it. Jodi Huisentruit was not the kind of person who drifted through rooms unnoticed. Friends remembered energy first, the kind that could fill a conversation before anyone realized how much time had passed. She had grown up in Long Prairie, Minnesota, and had built herself through competition and performance long before television entered the picture. She was athletic. She played golf. She played softball. She was ambitious in a way that did not feel abstract. Her ambition had shape. It had deadlines, it had markets and stations and tape reels and early shifts and the endless low-paid ladder of local television that people climb when they want to make it somewhere bigger. By the time she reached Mason City, she was already moving inside that ladder. Not at the top, not yet, but moving. Kent was not supposed to be the end of the road. It was a stop, a proving ground. One more market where she would work hard enough and present sharply enough and gain enough experience to move to a larger city and eventually to the kind of career she imagined for herself. She had worked in Cedar Rapids. She had worked in Alexandria, Minnesota. Now she was anchoring the morning news in Mason City and thinking beyond it. Morning news is a strange life. It sounds glamorous from a distance, because the person on television appears bright and awake and fully assembled before most viewers have even poured their first cup of coffee. But to live that job is to live against the body. It means alarms that go off in the blackest part of the night. It means makeup under fluorescent light while the rest of the town still sleeps. It means arriving so early that the world feels incomplete. Jodi's shift required her to be at the station in the early morning long before sunrise. That mattered on the day she disappeared, because it meant she was moving through the town at an hour when witnesses are fewer and ordinary sounds stand out more sharply than they do later in the day. It also meant that if something happened, there would be a terrible delay between the last person who spoke to her and the first person to physically see what had been left behind. Mason City itself matters too. This was not anonymous urban sprawl, not a city so large that faces disappear by default. Mason City was big enough for a public television anchor to be recognized and small enough for routines to feel stable. A familiar place, a manageable place. The kind of place where people still remember where the apartment complex sat and how short the drive to the television station was. A town with a normal surface, which is another way of saying a town where one break in that surface could echo for decades. The day before Jodi disappeared, she was doing something that fit her personality almost too well. She was at a Chamber of Commerce golf tournament. She spent the day out in public and then attended the dinner that followed. It was a long day by any standard, and even longer for someone whose workday began before dawn. That detail matters because one of the first hard facts in the timeline is that she appears to have overslept. Not vanished in the night, not failed to answer the phone. Overslept, the simple kind of human mistake that made sense after a day of golf and social activity and dinner and the demands of an early schedule. That is one reason the case hits so hard. The final morning does not begin with fear. It begins with a sleepy explanation. She had been tired. She had been living normally. She had every reason to expect another workday. There are other details around Jodi's life in Mason City that became more important only after she disappeared. She was social, she had friends at the station and outside it. She was close enough to viewers that people felt they knew her, but also private enough that many parts of her life could only be reconstructed later through memory and speculation. Some friends would later say she had mentioned being followed in the past and receiving harassing phone calls. She had reported in 1994 that a man in a small white pickup truck seemed to be following her, and she had taken self-defense training not long before she disappeared. Friends also recalled that she had talked about harassing calls and about changing her phone number. These details have become part of the case because they suggest the possibility that her disappearance did not begin on June 27th at all. That maybe the morning parking lot scene was the end of a longer line of attention aimed at her. But that is exactly where discipline matters. Concern is not proof. Fear is not identity. The fact that she felt watched at times does not tell us by whom. It does not settle whether the person who may have followed her months earlier had anything at all to do with what happened later. Still, it belongs in the story because it changes the emotional weather around her final weeks. It introduces the possibility that Jodi herself may have sensed some degree of danger long before anyone else did. By the summer of 1995, her contract at Kim, too, was due to expire in the fall. She was considering what came next. Larger markets, a move closer to her family, maybe even a move to a warmer state. That matters because it destroys one simplistic theory before it can take hold. There is no serious evidence that Jodi staged her own disappearance to begin a different life. The people who knew her spoke of plans and ambition and forward motion. Her disappearance reads not like an escape from a dead end, but like an interruption of a life already in motion. And interruption is the right word. Because when you step into the final full day of her life, there is no obvious omen hanging over every seam, no cinematic warning, no heavy conversation that cleanly predicts disaster. There is only accumulation. A long summer day, golf, dinner, fatigue. A young woman with a difficult work schedule heading back to an apartment where she expected a few hours of sleep before another pre-dawn start. That normality is not background. It is the thing the mystery destroys. The public often remembers this case through its evidence. The shoes, the bent key, the car. But before all of that, there was still a person having one more ordinary day, laughing with people, playing golf, thinking about work, thinking about the future, living inside the kind of private continuity that disappears the moment a case like this becomes public. That is why people around her kept searching memory after memory for the thing they might have missed. The comment that sounded slightly off. The person who lingered too long. The call that felt wrong. The mood shift that in hindsight might have meant something. In most cases like this, hindsight becomes a second crime scene. Everyone revisits it. Everyone wonders whether they stood next to the truth without recognizing it. And in Jodi's case, that instinct was made stronger by the way the story broke. Not with a body, not with a note, not with a trail extending outward, but with a few physical signs that suggested a struggle had happened in a space so small and familiar it seemed impossible that no one would have seen more. By the end of June 26, Jodi had every reason to think the next stage of her life was still ahead of her. She had no way to know that before the next morning ended. The entire country of her future would shrink into one unsolved question repeated across decades. What happened in that parking lot, and who was waiting for her there? Night narrows the story. This is where the case becomes a clock. The last publicly known movements before dawn are not dramatic. Jodi returns from the golf tournament and dinner. At some point, she goes home to the key apartments in Mason City. The building is not isolated in the way many people imagine when they first hear the story. That matters because the crime scene later forces people to confront a maddening fact. Whatever happened, happened in proximity to other lives, other apartments, other windows, other routines, other people sleeping through the hour when Jodi was supposed to leave for work. Somewhere inside that apartment she tries to sleep after a long day and a schedule that gives her very little margin for exhaustion. Morning anchors do not wake up to sunrise. They wake up to darkness. By the time most of the town is thinking about coffee, they have already been working for hours. Jodi was expected at Kim well before dawn. According to the later reconstructed timeline, she should have been at the station by around 3:30 in the morning to prepare for the morning show. When she did not arrive, an assistant producer called her to make sure she was coming in. Jodi apparently answered the phone sleepy and explained that she had overslept. She said she would be right in. That phone call is one of the load-bearing facts in this entire case. Without it, there would be more room for uncertainty, more time for imagination to wander, more possibility that something had happened hours earlier. But the call compresses everything. It tells us she was alive in her apartment. It tells us she was conscious enough to answer. It tells us she was aware of the time and aware that she was late. Most importantly, it tells us she intended to leave immediately. There is something unbearably mundane about that exchange. It is not a call loaded with fear. It is not a cryptic goodbye. It is exactly the kind of call that happens every day in workplaces everywhere. A coworker checks in. Someone apologizes. Someone says they are on the way. In an ordinary life, the call means nothing after the day ends. In this case, it becomes one of the last points of certainty anyone ever gets. The words matter because they place Jodi on one side of the fracture, alive, embarrassed, rushing, still attached to all the normal obligations of that morning. Then silence. From there, the timeline becomes almost cruelly narrow. Her apartment was on the second floor. Her red Mazda Miata was parked close to the building. According to Find Jodi's reconstruction, it was barely a dozen steps away, and the attack likely happened within 30 seconds of her leaving the apartment. That estimate has become part of why the case feels so impossible. 30 seconds is not a journey. It is not enough time for a person to meaningfully leave one world and enter another. It is just enough time to walk downstairs, cross a small lot, reach for a car door, and be interrupted. When you try to imagine the scene, it becomes clear why the crime appears to have been one of either preparation or immediate opportunity. This was not the kind of event that seems to evolve gradually. There was no long walk through open space, no extended window of vulnerability. If the reconstruction is right, then whoever took Jodi either knew when she would emerge or happened upon her at exactly the right moment and was able to overpower her quickly enough to leave behind a partial scene rather than a fully witnessed one. The parking lot itself tells the story of interruption. Jodi did not get into the car and drive away. She reached the point where driving should have begun, and instead something else began. A bent key suggests she had at least gotten as far as the car door before the attack. Investigators have said the key was slightly bent in a way that led them to believe it had been in the driver's side door lock when she was assaulted. Personal items were scattered nearby, including shoes, earrings, a blow-dryer, and hairspray. The scene showed signs of a struggle. That picture is one reason this case keeps such a hold on people. The items feel intimate, the kind of things that belong to the last 10 minutes of getting ready. Hairspray, a blow-dryer, earrings, shoes. They are the debris of ordinary female routine thrown into the language of violence, and because those items were found outside the car, rather than inside it, the crime scene seems to capture the instant where an ordinary departure became a forced one. There is also the matter of what was not found. No blood publicly tied to the scene in a way that settled the case. No clear route of removal visible to the public. No confirmed eyewitness to the abduction itself. No body. This is the paradox at the heart of the morning. The scene looks loud in terms of implication. A struggle, scattered belongings, a bent key. But it remains quiet in terms of closure. It tells you something happened. It refuses to tell you exactly what. There are reports that neighbors or nearby residents heard sounds in the early morning hours, including what some recalled as a scream between 4 and 5. There were also witness accounts involving a white van in the area. But as with many details in this case, those accounts exist in a space between possible importance and possible dead end. They could matter enormously or not at all. That ambiguity is part of what makes the timeline so difficult to inhabit. The most likely period of attack is narrow. The physical evidence strongly suggests an abduction. Yet the edges of the event are blurred by uncertain witness memory and the darkness of the hour. You can see the center of the crime without being able to see its full shape. At some point during this narrow window, the station realized Jodi had not arrived. That in itself was unusual enough to draw concern. Former co-workers have noted she had not missed a day of work that year. The absence was not in character. The concern moved from routine annoyance to alarm. A co-worker called police for a welfare check. An officer arrived at the apartment complex around 7:16 in the morning and found the scene that turned the case instantly from a missing person concern into evidence of probable foul play. That timing matters too. By the time police reached the lot, whatever had happened was already several hours old. If Jodi had been taken, then the person responsible had time, not days, not weeks, but enough time to widen the problem beyond the perimeter of that apartment complex. Enough time to move her elsewhere. Enough time to erase the cleanest trail that might have existed right after the attack. Enough time for sunrise to arrive over a scene that still held signs of violence, but no living witness. This is where many unsolved disappearances lose their grip, because the victim's last hours are too vague or too fragmented to feel immediate. Jodi's case is the opposite. The timeline is so sharp it becomes painful. A call answered, a promise to come right in, a walk of a few steps, a struggle by the car, and then a complete blank where the rest of her life should have been. That is why the first 30 minutes of this case are enough to sustain decades of public attention. Not because they explain anything, because they explain just enough to make the absence unbearable. You can see the point of contact. You can almost hear the pace of the morning. You can reconstruct the direction of movement down to the level of a few seconds, and then everything after that is gone. The case has been living inside that gap ever since. Once police saw the parking lot, the case changed shape immediately. There are missing person calls that begin with caution. A family member cannot reach someone. A friend reports unusual silence. An officer checks a residence and finds nothing clearly wrong. This was not that kind of morning. From the start, the physical scene around Jodi's car suggested that whatever had prevented her from arriving at the station was not a simple delay and not a voluntary disappearance. The car was still in the lot. Her belongings were not arranged in any normal way. The key was bent. Items were scattered. Investigators later described signs of a struggle and drag marks on the surface of the parking lot. A partial palm print was recovered from the car, and a strand of hair was also found, though it has never been publicly established that either item has solved the case. That distinction matters because people often hear that forensic evidence exists and assume a case like this should eventually resolve itself through science. But evidence is only powerful when it can be tied with confidence to the crime and to a person. A partial palm print is not a confession. A hair without public context is not a solved mystery. The sad truth of many cold cases is that pieces are found, but never made to speak with enough certainty. At the apartment complex, officers would have had to work quickly, preserve the scene, identify who had seen or heard anything, determine whether Jodi might somehow be nearby injured or hiding or in shock. But the scene itself appears to have pointed strongly away from any scenario in which she had simply left on her own. That is why the case is so often described as an abduction rather than a disappearance in the abstract. The language followed the evidence. The evidence said interruption and force. The challenge was that the evidence did not say by whom. It is worth staying in that parking lot a little longer, because the scene is the emotional center of the entire investigation. Everything after it is theory. Everything before it is routine. The scene is the only place where the two collide. Imagine the red Miata parked close to the building. Imagine the light before sunrise not fully developed. Imagine one shoe off, then another, a bent key at the driver's side. Small objects from the beginning of a workday dropped or torn loose into a space where they do not belong. There is almost something offensively intimate about it. A blow dryer on asphalt, hairspray near a car, items associated with preparation and presentation and ordinary self-assembly sitting where violence left them. It makes the crime feel abrupt and physical and close. And because there was no body and no final proven destination, those objects became the fixed symbols of the case, not just evidence. Icons, the public memory of what was left when Jodi was not. As the investigation began, friends, co-workers, and investigators had to reconstruct the last day and the last known relationships around her. Who had seen her the night before? Who knew her schedule? Who might have known where she lived? Who could plausibly have been in the area before dawn? This is where unsolved cases often become crowded with names. Some deserve scrutiny. Some become attached to the story, mainly because they were close enough to it to remain in public memory. Over time, the pressure to produce resolution can distort that distinction. And Jodi's case has lived under that pressure for 3 decades. One figure whose name has always hovered over the case is John Vancis. He was an older friend of Jodi's who said he had been with her the evening before she disappeared and that she came to his apartment to watch a video of a surprise birthday party he had helped host for her earlier that month. He became a public person of interest in the case, and later legal fights focused on sealed warrants involving GPS data from 2 vehicles connected to him. But he was never publicly charged in Jodi's disappearance, and no court ever established him as the person responsible. It is important to be exact here. People of interest are not convictions. Suspicion is not proof. Vancis's presence in the timeline matters because proximity matters in any case like this. But proximity alone does not close the case. The same goes for the witness descriptions involving a white van. At least 2 witnesses remembered a white van in the area early that morning. Yet no public person of interest in the case is known to have owned a white Ford Econoline van, and Find Jodi has repeatedly stressed that the van could be crucial or could be another dead end. That uncertainty runs through the whole investigation. There are moments where the case seems almost solvable. A vehicle, a witness, a print, a hair, a person close to the victim. Then the chain breaks, and because the chain breaks, the case stays balanced in that agonizing zone where nothing can be fully ignored and nothing can be fully trusted to carry the whole weight of explanation. Media attention intensified quickly. A missing anchor creates a particular kind of public reaction because the victim is already familiar in a mediated way. Viewers have seen her face in their homes. Coworkers know she is supposed to appear at a certain hour. The absence is visible not only to family and police, but to an audience. That made Jodi's disappearance both more public and more distorted from the beginning. The public felt immediate personal connection to her and at the same time learned about the case through incomplete reports and fragmentary updates. In a different case, investigators might be able to control the release of detail more tightly. Here the story had already escaped into the town and beyond. That is not always good for an investigation. It can produce tips and attention. It can also produce rumor and fixation. One of the most frustrating aspects of the early investigation is how little has ever been publicly released about certain evidence, and how much that vacuum invited speculation. Retired investigators have acknowledged that there was not a lot of evidence, period, and that some information has been withheld for investigative reasons. That withholding makes sense from a law enforcement standpoint. If a suspect emerges, you want facts only the offender would know. You do not want to contaminate statements. You do not want false confessions built from publicly available detail. But the same withholding that protects a case can also turn it into a magnet for narrative invention. When people know there is evidence, but do not know exactly what it means, they start building their own versions of what the hidden center must contain. As a result, Jodi's case has sometimes felt divided into two realities: the official investigation that knows more than it says, and the public case that says more than it knows. Somewhere between those two realities, Jodi herself can get lost. That is one reason it matters to keep returning to the basics. She did not vanish from a fog of rumor. She vanished from a specific place under a tightly compressed timeline, with signs of a struggle by her car. That remains the core. Everything else has to be judged by whether it actually helps explain that event. The first search efforts were built on urgency and the assumption that time still mattered in the most direct sense. Canvass the area. Talk to neighbors. Check routes. Consider whether she may have been forced into another vehicle. But the challenge with an abduction that happens close to the victim's home before dawn is that the search zone expands almost instantly. Once a person is moved, the logic of proximity collapses. The scene becomes origin rather than destination. And with each passing hour, the chances of finding the victim nearby shrink. That is one reason abduction cases feel so terrifying even to investigators. The central truth often arrives quickly while the usable trail disappears even faster. The central truth in Jodi's case arrived in the form of that parking lot. The usable trail did not. If someone abducted her, then that person seems to have controlled the next stage of the timeline almost completely. No confirmed recovery site, no body, no public forensic breakthrough. That settled the question. Only a city waking up around a scene that looked unmistakably wrong, and a television station confronting the reality that the woman expected to read the morning news was now at the center of a crime no one could explain. For viewers and readers, the case would become an enduring mystery. For those who knew her, it became something more punishing, a life split into before and after by a scene too violent to dismiss and too incomplete to ever bring peace. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation moved in two directions at once. One direction went outward into the practical work of law enforcement: leads, tips, possible vehicles, associates, background checks, forensic questions. The other direction went inward into memory. Who was Jodi really when the camera was off? What pressures was she under? What private fears had she mentioned? What parts of her life could help explain why someone might have targeted her? That second direction matters, because Jodi was immediately turned into an image. A smiling anchor, a missing face on television, a case file. But a person disappears differently than an image does. A person leaves patterns behind, and in the years after June 1995, people around Jodi kept returning to those patterns, trying to understand whether they had missed the shape of danger while she was still alive. Friends described her as upbeat and driven, not someone withdrawing from life, not someone drifting into self-destruction. She had goals. She wanted a bigger career. She wanted to move forward. That matters because one of the laziest instincts around unsolved disappearances is to quietly imagine that the victim may have chosen disappearance rather than suffered it. In Jodi's case, the evidence in the parking lot already pushed strongly against that idea, but her life pushed against it too. Nothing about the public record suggests a woman preparing to abandon everything. What it suggests is a woman in transition toward more. That makes the interruption more violent, not less. She had dreams that belonged to time, a better market, a bigger station, a wider audience. Those dreams become part of the crime, because the crime cuts through them before they have the chance to become ordinary history. Her work in television also changed the psychology of the case. Morning anchors enter people's lives through repetition. The audience sees them at vulnerable hours, while getting ready for work, school, and family routine. That familiarity creates a specific kind of grief when something happens to them. Not exactly intimacy, not exactly distance. Something stranger. People felt like they knew Jodi enough to care immediately, and not well enough to understand what hidden forces might have moved around her life. That gap fed public obsession. So did the symbolic violence of the scene. The red shoes were reported and remembered almost instantly. The bent key, too. These objects do not just suggest struggle, they tell a story about visibility. The woman who carefully assembled herself for the camera every morning was reduced in the public imagination to items scattered across asphalt. That is not a sentimental point. It is a clue to why the case remains emotionally potent. The crime attacked not only a body, but a routine of self-presentation. It interrupted a person on the threshold between private and public life. Inside her apartment, she was still a woman getting ready for work. By the time investigators saw the scene, she had become the subject of a citywide emergency and soon a regional and national mystery. There were also stories that complicated how people looked back on her final months. Jodi had spoken to some friends about feeling followed. She had told people about harassing phone calls. She had taken steps toward self-defense. Again, none of this proves who ultimately abducted her, but it does tell us that the possibility of unwanted attention did not emerge only after the crime. It existed before. That matters because it changes how we interpret the parking lot. Not as the sudden arrival of danger into an untouched life, but as the possible culmination of danger she had already sensed in fragments. At the same time, caution is essential. Many women in public-facing jobs deal with harassment that never escalates to violent crime. Many people receive calls or experience following incidents that lead nowhere identifiable. The temptation in cold cases is to connect every fearful detail into one unbroken line. Reality is rarely that neat. Some warnings matter, some do not. Part of the cruelty of this case is that we still do not know which fears in Jodi's life were ordinary background hazards of being a visible young woman and which may have pointed directly toward the person who took her. In the years after the abduction, the case accumulated a strange secondary life: anniversaries, retrospectives, interviews with former co-workers and investigators, community vigils. Each one kept Jodi present, and each one also slowly changed the texture of the case. The longer a disappearance remains unsolved, the more the missing person risks becoming a symbol instead of a human being, a permanent headline, a familiar image repeated without growth. That is why the memories shared by friends and family remain important. They return depth to the story. Her humor, her competitiveness, her ability to connect with people, her restlessness for a bigger future. Without those details, the case becomes only a crime scene. With them, the crime scene becomes what it really is: the violent interruption of a particular life. The Mason City community lived with that interruption in a way outsiders never fully could. Every familiar landmark linked back to the case. The station, the apartment complex, the route between them. The city itself became part witness and part memorial. There are crimes so large that a place vanishes inside them, and there are crimes so precise that a place can never quite escape them. Jodi's disappearance did something like that to Mason City. It marked the city with a time of day. Before dawn, The hour when the parking lot was still dark enough to hide certainty and light enough to leave behind a scene no one could ignore. For the station, the loss had its own violence. Cow workers were among the first to feel the timeline break. They expected her on set. They called. They heard the sleepy answer. Then they had to confront the growing silence where she should have been. Television is built on sequence and continuity. Shows begin on time. Segments follow one another. Faces appear where audiences expect them. Jodi's disappearance ripped that sequence apart in the most literal way possible. The story the station suddenly had to cover was the disappearance of one of its own. That is almost too sharp a cruel irony to process. A journalist becomes a subject, and anchor becomes the story. And because the story remains unsolved, the transformation never ends. She is still frozen in that role in the public mind, not only as Jodi the person, but as Jodi the unresolved report. The passage of time complicates every cold case. In the first days, urgency dominates. Then hope mutates into endurance. Then endurance hardens into ritual. Anniversary coverage. Appeals for information. Repeating the same proven facts because they are still all anyone really has. For Jodi's family, this meant a decades-long life without finality. For investigators, it meant carrying a case forward through changes in personnel leadership and forensic technology. For the public, it meant watching the distance between 1995 and the present grow larger, while the core image of the parking lot remained exactly the same. And there is something uniquely painful about a cold case rooted in public memory, because the victim does not disappear alone. She disappears in front of a community that keeps having to reimagine the same morning again and again. Could someone have seen more? Could someone have spoken sooner? Could one detail have changed the entire course of the investigation? This is especially true in Jodi's case because so much depends on tiny intervals. A few steps. A few seconds. One call. One absent arrival. A witness who might have been looking at the right place at the wrong moment, or the wrong place at the right moment. The scale of the mystery is built from smallness. A small parking lot, a small town, a short drive, a narrow window. That scale is deceptive because it makes people feel resolution should be closer than it is. Surely something this local can be solved. Surely someone knows. Surely evidence this clear should have pointed to one person by now. And yet the case continues to resist exactly that kind of confidence. Even now, when people discuss Jodi Huisentruit, the conversation tends to fracture in familiar ways. Some focus on the stalking angle. Some focus on individuals in her orbit. Some focus on the crime scene and what it must imply about the nature of the abduction. Some focus on the possibility that police know more than they have ever released. All of those emphases contain some logic. None of them have closed the case. What remains undeniable is more modest and more terrible. Jodi was living a recognizable life. Working hard, planning ahead, showing up on screen, moving through the ordinary fatigue and ambition of local television. Then, one morning before dawn, that life was interrupted by force outside her car. Everything after that has been a struggle to catch up to a crime that happened faster than anyone could see it, and cleaner than anyone has been able to explain. This is why her case still feels alive, rather than merely old. It is not sustained by nostalgia. It is sustained by incompletion, by a sense that the narrative of her life was broken in a place so exposed that someone must still be carrying the missing knowledge that would restore it. That belief has kept people searching. It has also kept the case emotionally dangerous, because with every passing year, the desire for answers grows, while the public space between facts and hopes grows larger too. And in that space, the temptation to choose a satisfying theory over a disciplined truth becomes stronger. The rest of this story lives inside that tension. Every famous unsolved case develops an ecosystem of theory. Some theories begin in evidence. Some begin in personality. Some begin in the emotional need to force a shape onto uncertainty. Jodi Huisentruit's case has all three. And because there has never been a body and never been a public charge, the theories have had room to live much longer than they should in any disciplined investigation. So this is where the story has to slow down. Not because the theories are unimportant, because they are, but because a case can be damaged by giving weak ideas the same weight as strong ones. The strongest theory in Jodi's case has never really changed. She was abducted from the parking lot by someone who either knew her routine or had sufficient opportunity to act in a very narrow time window. That broad theory is not speculative. It is the most reasonable reading of the known evidence. The struggle signs around the car indicate force. The timing suggests a quick interception. The absence of any later confirmed sighting and the lack of a body suggest that once she was taken, she was moved beyond immediate recovery. That much seems solid. What is not solid is the identity of the person who did it and whether the abduction was planned around Jodi specifically or opportunistic within a pattern of predatory behavior. The targeted offender theory is powerful for obvious reasons. Jodi had a visible public job. She followed a demanding routine. She left home before dawn. Some friends believed she had reason to fear she was being watched. If someone had become fixated on her, they could have learned her schedule over time. They could have anticipated where she would be and when. They might have known that at that hour witnesses would be sparse and that she would be walking alone. Friends later recalled her concerns about being followed and about harassing calls. This theory explains a great deal. It explains the speed of the attack. It explains why the crime appears to have occurred so close to her apartment and car. It explains why the offender may have been ready with a second vehicle. It explains why the scene suggests a sudden overpowering rather than a long interaction. What it does not explain is identity. No publicly known suspect has been tied to the crime strongly enough to carry the case to trial. And this is where a theory can be both persuasive in structure and unresolved in fact. Another major focus has always been the circle of people who knew Jodi personally. That is not unusual. Investigators naturally examine close contacts in violent disappearances. Who last saw her? Who had access to her schedule? Who may have had emotional investment in her? Who may have been rejected by her or preoccupied with her? The public face of this angle in Jodi's case became John Vancis. He was older than Jodi and described as a friend. He said Jodi came by his apartment the night before her disappearance to watch a videotape of a surprise birthday party held for her earlier that month. Over time, his name became deeply attached to the case in public discussion, and later court battles revealed that in 2017 investigators sought GPS-related data concerning 2 vehicles connected to him through a sealed warrant. But none of that equals proof of guilt. He was never publicly charged in the case, and no judicial proceeding established him as the offender before his death in 2024. It is worth pausing on why his name became so central. Part of it was proximity. Part of it was the basic logic that the last known people in a victim's orbit deserve scrutiny. Part of it was the public nature of his friendship with Jodi and the way unusual details around that friendship were absorbed into media coverage. But part of it was also the vacuum left by the unsolved case itself. When a case remains open for decades, the public often fixes on one dominant figure because a human mind prefers a face to an absence. That does not mean the focus is wrong. It means the focus can become more psychologically satisfying than evidentially complete. There were other names over the years as well. Sex offenders. Predatory men in the region. Individuals later connected to unrelated crimes against women. People whose behavior or history made them easy to imagine inside this case. Some were publicly discussed and later dismissed. Some remained part of the outer ring of speculation. The problem with these theories is not that predators in the region are irrelevant. The problem is that similarity is not identity. Cold case culture has a habit of building bridges from resonance. This man attacked women. That man drove a van. Another man lived nearby. But unless those bridges land on evidence, they remain emotional architecture, not investigative proof. The white van reports are a perfect example of this problem. A white van was seen in the area by witnesses around the time Jodi disappeared. That sounds dramatic because it is dramatic. A dark early morning parking lot and a white van nearby feels like the visual answer to the case. But even the Find Jodi team has stressed that the van may be crucial or may be entirely unrelated. No publicly known person of interest has been tied to owning the specific type of white van witnesses described. This is one of the hardest things about the case. The details that feel most cinematic are often the least stable. A van in the right place can become the center of public imagination without ever becoming the center of legal proof. There is also the possibility that the abductor was not someone deeply obsessed with Jodi personally, but someone who recognized vulnerability and seized it. A predator passing through, a person familiar with the area but not intimately connected to her life, someone who saw a lone woman leaving before dawn and acted. This theory has its own strengths. It requires less prior knowledge of her routines if the offender had simply been in the area often enough to know that early movement happened there. It aligns with the speed of the attack. It also fits the uncomfortable reality that some violent crimes are committed, not by people in the victim's close circle, but by offenders whose relationship to the victim begins and ends in the act itself. But again, there are weaknesses. Opportunistic abductions are risky. Pulling one off in a parking lot without leaving behind enough evidence to later identify the offender suggests confidence preparation or luck of a very specific kind. The more efficient the crime appears, the harder it becomes to believe the offender was acting entirely on impulse. Then there is the possibility of partial familiarity. Someone who knew of Jodi but was not close to her. Someone who saw her on television or around town. Someone whose attention had sharpened over time without becoming visible to the people around her. This hybrid theory often feels plausible because it explains the mix of speed and apparent confidence while leaving room for the stalking concerns she had voiced before. But like the others, it stops at the same point. It offers a shape, not a name. One thing that deserves rejection is the idea that Jodi voluntarily disappeared. The crime scene itself weighs heavily against it. So does her pattern of life. So do her plans. So does the total absence of credible evidence that she reappeared elsewhere or tried to construct a new identity. In cold cases, people sometimes cling to voluntary disappearance because it is perversely comforting. If the missing person chose it, then the horror shrinks. The offender vanishes. The cruelty becomes self-generated rather than imposed from outside. But in Jodi's case, that explanation collapses under the evidence. Another weak theory is that she was killed at the parking lot and somehow concealed there in a way that investigators missed. The known scene suggests struggle and removal, not completion. If she had been murdered there and left nearby, it is difficult to imagine the case maintaining such complete physical emptiness for so long. The lack of a body points more persuasively toward transport away from the scene. That is one reason the case generates so much focus on vehicles and on who may have had the means to move her quickly. Theories around police knowledge also deserve care. Because the case has remained open for so long, and because investigators have said they are withholding information, many people assume police must know the likely offender already, but simply lack the last piece. That is possible. It is also possible that the withheld details are not the near solution people imagine, but rather the fragile remnants of a case whose best chance was damaged by time from the very beginning. Those two possibilities feel very different emotionally. One promises eventual revelation. The other suggests a permanent asymmetry between what happened and what can now be proved. And that is the darkest possibility in any cold case. Not that no one has a theory that the truth may exist in a form thinner than proof, known by someone who will never speak, partly inferred by investigators who can never close the distance, scattered across memory and geography in ways that will never align cleanly enough for court. That possibility is what haunts Jodi's case when all the louder theories go quiet. Because after the names and the vehicles and the fragments of forensic evidence and the stories of fear, there remains one stubborn fact. A woman was almost certainly abducted from her apartment parking lot on the way to work. The scene tells us that much. The rest of the case is a war between probability and proof. Probability says some theories are stronger than others. Proof says none have yet been enough. That does not mean all theories are equal. They are not. The most grounded reading still points toward a forced abduction by someone who either targeted Jodi specifically or targeted her type of vulnerability with disturbing precision. But until a person can be tied to that act with evidence stronger than inference, the theory remains exactly that. A reading of the crime, not the final answer to it. And so the case continues in the maddening place where investigators and the public often meet. Not in certainty, in narrowed possibility. That may sound close to resolution. It is not. It is just close enough to keep the wound open. Time has not ended this case. It has only changed the tools and the shape of hope. One of the defining features of the Jodi Huisentruit investigation is that it never fully went cold in the emotional sense. The years passed, police chiefs changed, investigators retired or were replaced, technology advanced, media formats transformed. But the case itself remained active in a way many disappearances do not. It persisted in official files and in public ritual. That persistence matters because it tells us something about both the strength and weakness of the evidence. There was enough there to keep returning to, never enough to close. In 2001, Jodi was declared legally dead. That declaration did not solve anything. It only acknowledged what the years had already made unbearable, that the law could not force life back into a timeline that had ended in a parking lot 6 years earlier. For her family and those closest to her, the declaration carried a bitter kind of finality without knowledge, a bureaucratic step toward acknowledging loss while the actual truth of the loss remained hidden. That is one of the cruelest things about long unsolved disappearances. The emotional life of the case moves in one direction while the legal and factual life remains stuck. A person becomes legally dead while remaining narratively unresolved, and the family is forced to live in both realities at once. Through the 2000s and beyond, the case remained visible, partly because of journalism and partly because of stubborn personal commitment. Find Jodi was co-founded in 2003 by journalists Josh Benson and Gary Peterson, and became one of the main public engines keeping the case from sinking into archive dust. Over the years, it has maintained timelines, published interviews, revisited evidence, and kept pressure on the idea that Jodi's disappearance should not simply become a local legend detached from active responsibility. That kind of long-form civic memory is not common. It changes a case. It does not solve it by itself, but it keeps public attention from flattening into myth. It also means every new search, every new warrant fight, every new media project lands in a landscape where details are already heavily loaded with history. In more recent years, several developments reminded everyone that the case was still moving even if it was not resolving. Legal efforts sought to unseal a 2017 search warrant related to GPS data from 2 vehicles connected to John Vancis. Those efforts kept public focus on the possibility that investigators had pursued more specific lines than outsiders knew. At the same time, the county fought to keep certain materials sealed, suggesting the case still contained sensitive investigatory value. Again, the temptation is to interpret this too neatly. Sealed materials feel like buried answers. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they are simply one more partial avenue in a case built from partial avenues. What matters is that investigators were still working, still pulling on lines that had not yet broken. Then came the Winsted, Minnesota searches. In 2024, investigators searched an area there on an old lead connected to the case and found no signs of human remains. In early 2026, Mason City Police returned to Winsted for another search, and again nothing was found. The searches were featured in new coverage and in the 2025 Hulu docuseries, Her Last Broadcast, which revisited the case with new interviews and renewed attention. These developments matter for two reasons. First, they prove the case is not dead to law enforcement. Second, they reveal the recurring emotional structure of the investigation. A lead surfaces. Hope rises. Search teams go out. News cameras return. Nothing is found. The case contracts again into absence. That cycle has repeated for 30 years, and every repetition deepens the case rather than settling it, because each unsuccessful search tells the public two things at once. Police still believe there is enough to follow, and the truth is still somehow just beyond reach. Modern forensic hope has also shaped how people think about Jodi's case. DNA transformed many old investigations. Genetic genealogy has solved cases once thought impossible. Digital mapping and data storage make old timelines newly searchable. There is a natural urge to believe that if a case survives long enough, technology will eventually rescue it. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes technology only sharpens the outline of what is missing. In Jodi's case, the available public record suggests that investigators do have some physical evidence. What remains unclear is whether that evidence can now be meaningfully tied to a living suspect or to a prosecutable chain of events. This is where old cases reveal a hard truth. Technology can extract more from evidence. It cannot create evidence that was never there or was never preserved strongly enough at the start. The first hours of a case still matter more than the best tools of 30 years later. That does not mean later tools are useless. It means they work best when the original case left enough behind to work on. One reason people continue to follow Jodi's case is that it seems as if it should be solvable. That phrase comes up again and again around certain disappearances, not simply because people want hope, because the case feels too concentrated to remain unanswered. There was a scene. There were signs of force. There were likely witnesses to pieces of the morning. There were names in her orbit. There were possible vehicles. How can something that visible remain unfinished? But that question contains its own answer. Visible is not the same as complete. A crime can be obvious in nature and obscure in proof. An abduction can be plain, and the offender still hidden. A parking lot can be full of implications, and almost empty of admissible certainty. That is where Jodi's case has lived for 3 decades. In the distance between what everyone can reasonably believe happened and what no one has yet been able to prove happened in full. The 2025 docuseries brought the case to a new audience and reminded an older one that time alone does not dissolve certain stories. Hulu's own summary described a 1995 news anchor who vanished under mysterious circumstances and suggested that the biggest leads in decades could mean finally solving the case. Whether those leads amount to resolution remains unknown. What is certain is that the story still generates enough public force to bring new witnesses' memories and interpretations into circulation. Even that renewed attention has its dangers. Every major retelling reopens the balance between awareness and distortion. More eyes can mean new tips. They can also mean new rumor. For a case like Jodi's, awareness matters because silence protects old crimes. But awareness must be tethered to discipline, or it becomes another layer of fog. 30 years later, the hardest part of this story may be that there is still movement without a rival. Police still search. Warrants still matter. Media still returns. People still gather to remember her. Friends and family still speak. And yet the same central image remains untouched. Her car in the parking lot. Her belongings on the ground. No answer beside them. This is what makes the case feel less like a memory and more like an active wound in slow motion. The years have added context. They have not added conclusion. The file is older. The mystery is not smaller. If anything, it has become heavier, because time has removed easy explanations while leaving the original violence exactly where it was, on the pavement beside a red Miata before dawn. There is a version of this case that exists entirely in evidence. The apartment, the phone call, the car, the key, the shoes, the scattered belongings, the possible palm print, the possible hair, the witness reports, the names that returned, again and again, over the years. That version matters because evidence is the only part of an unsolved case that can eventually become justice. But there is another version of the case, and it exists in the mind. It is the version people live with, the version built not from documents alone, but from the image that will not leave. A woman late for work, a short walk before sunrise, a city still asleep. Then a break in reality so sudden it seems impossible that the world ever closed over it. That is why Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance still feels contemporary even after 3 decades. It violates the scale people trust. If someone vanishes in remote wilderness, people can at least imagine the land as accomplice. If someone disappears after days of uncertainty, people can imagine a long hidden chain of decisions and movements. Jodi's case offers neither comfort. It is compressed, local. Close. The violence appears to happen in one of the most ordinary spaces imaginable, a residential parking lot. And because it happened there, the case keeps asking the same disturbing question. How can an event so concentrated still refuse explanation? Perhaps the answer lies in how abduction works, when it works exactly the way an offender needs it to. Fast, controlled, timed to the victim's routine and to the weakness of the hour. Perhaps the answer lies in one person's long silence. Perhaps in evidence that exists but has never reached the threshold of certainty. Perhaps in a witness who does not realize what they know. Perhaps in memory degraded just enough to deny the final connection. Or perhaps the answer lies in a harder truth. That some crimes happen with enough clarity to scar a community and enough incompleteness to defeat it. That is the special cruelty of this case. Not that there is no story. There is a story. But it stops in the middle of its most important sentence. Jodi's life after that morning has been written by absence, by family statements, by coworkers remembering the call that should have led to an ordinary workday, by investigators guarding details and following leads that rise and vanish, by a public that still returns to the same scene because something in it feels solvable and therefore unbearable. No body means no grave in the ordinary sense. No charge means no courtroom ending. No confession means no final narrative to absorb the pain. Instead, the case remains distributed, partly in Mason City, partly in Minnesota, partly in sealed records and old witness memory, partly in the minds of people who were not there but cannot stop seeing the lot in their imagination. This is where cold cases become larger than their own files, not because the facts grow, because the void around them does. Jodi would be much older now than she was on screen in those remembered broadcasts. That is another quiet cruelty. The victim never ages in public memory, but the people who loved her do. The investigators do. The city does. The unresolved question travels through time, while the woman at its center remains 27 and perpetually on the edge of leaving for work. Maybe that is why the details have stayed so sharp. The red Mazda Miata, the bent key in the door, the shoes on the pavement. They are not just clues. They are the last ordinary things touched by a life. Before that, life disappeared into criminal silence. And perhaps that is the real reason this case has endured with such force. Because it denies us the transition that most tragedies eventually provide. There is no proven final location, no completed map of events, no full handoff from life into death. Only interruption, only the violent suggestion of what happened and the decades-long refusal of the world to say where the rest of her story went. For investigators, the hope must be practical, evidence improved by time or technology, a witness who finally speaks, a mistake by the offender now visible in hindsight, a sealed line of inquiry that eventually becomes public and actionable. For the public, the hope is simpler, that the person who did this can still be named, that the certainty everyone has felt since that morning can one day be matched by proof. Until then, the case remains what it has been since the beginning. A short walk that became an endless absence. A call that should have led to arrival and instead led to one of the most haunting, unsolved abductions in American local news history, and a reminder that some mysteries do not survive because they are elaborate. They survive because they are brutally plain. She was home. She answered the phone. She said she was on her way. Her car was waiting outside. Then she was gone. If you have your own thoughts on the case, share them in the comments. And if you want more investigations like this from Silent Echo, please subscribe and like the video. Stay with us for the next case.